Hello again, and welcome to Broadcasting Scotland. It's Sunday the 31st of July. I'm Andrew Wilson, and welcome to the Full Scottish. This afternoon, I have the latest daily update from Ukraine on day 158 of the illegal Russian war of aggression. Then I will introduce our guest for this afternoon, and then together we will look in a little bit more depth at the past week's key headlines. Ukrainian officials have denounced a call by Russia's embassy in the UK for fighters from the Azov regiment to face a humiliating execution. Twitter said that the embassy had violated its rules on hateful conduct, but put a warning on the tweet rather than banning the post. Andriy Yermak, the head of the Office of the Ukrainian Presidency, responded on Telegram on Saturday, saying, "Russia is a terrorist state. In the 21st century, only savages and terrorists can talk at the diplomatic level about the fact that people deserve to be executed by hanging. Russia is a state sponsor of terrorism. What more evidence is needed?" Horrific video has emerged that appears to show a Russian soldier castrating a Ukrainian prisoner, who other reports suggest was subsequently murdered. According to The Guardian, the footage was originally posted on pro-Russian Telegram channels. Renewed Russian strikes on Ukraine's front line have left one person dead in the south of the country and also hit a school in Kharkiv, officials have said. The mayor of the southern city of Mykolaiv said one person was killed when rockets pounded two residential districts overnight. In Ukraine's second city of Kharkiv, rockets from an S-300 surface-to-air system destroyed part of an educational facility, local officials have said. Russia has announced it is banning 32 New Zealand officials and journalists from entering its territory in response to similar measures taken by Wellington against Moscow over the invasion of Ukraine. The Ukrainian military said it had killed scores of Russian soldiers and destroyed two ammunition dumps in fighting in the Kherson region, the focus of Kyiv's counter-offensive in the south and a key link in Moscow's supply lines. Rail traffic to Kherson over the Dnipro River had been cut, potentially further isolating Russian forces west of the river from supplies in occupied Crimea and the east, according to reports. Gazprom has suspended gas supplies to Latvia following tensions between Moscow and the West over the conflict in Ukraine and sweeping sanctions against Russia, AFP news agency has reported. Gazprom drastically cut gas supplies to Europe via the Nord Stream pipeline on Wednesday to about 20% of capacity. European Union states have accused Russia of squeezing supplies in retaliation for Western sanctions over Moscow's invasion of Ukraine. Russia and Ukraine have both launched criminal investigations into strikes that have reportedly killed at least 50 Ukrainian prisoners of war who were held at a pre-trial detention centre in the village of Olenivka, after both countries blamed the other side for the attack. The UN is prepared to send a group of experts to Olenivka to investigate the incident if it gets the consent from both parties. Ukraine's Foreign Minister Dmytro Kuleba has accused Russia of a petrifying war crime over the killings and called on world leaders to recognise Russia as a terrorist state. Ukraine has said it is ready for grain exports to leave its ports again, but is waiting for the go-ahead from the UN. And based on UK government data, there have been 40,343 applications by Ukrainian refugees to live in Scotland, and 30,668 visas have been issued. All things being equal, with 10 times the population, you might expect there to have been between 400,000 applications and 300,000 visas issued to live in England, but there were only 86,000 applications and 77,000 visas issued respectively. On that basis, Scotland has been at least 4 times as welcoming. Thanks to Professor John Robertson for making that point. Now, this afternoon, we are lucky enough to be joined by Richard Thomson MP. Richard is the SNP MP for Gordon and has been an MP continuously since December 2019. He currently undertakes the roles of Shadow SNP Deputy Spokesperson, Treasury Financial Secretary, Shadow SNP Spokesperson Northern Ireland, and the Shadow SNP Spokesperson Wales. In 2015, he became the leader of the SNP group of councillors in Aberdeenshire, serving as co-leader of the council until 2017 and as leader of the opposition until he stood down as a councillor following his election to Westminster. Richard, good afternoon. How are you keeping?
Not so bad. How's yourself?
All the better for seeing you. Thank you for joining us on Broadcasting Scotland this afternoon. Now, the first thing I think we should talk about this afternoon, Richard, is that while welcoming an end to 7 annual increases in drugs deaths, Drugs Policy Minister Angela Constance has made clear that the situation remains unacceptable and work will continue at pace to address the emergency. The latest National Records of Scotland statistics show that 1,330 people lost their lives in 2021, a decrease of 1%, and Ms Constance says it is clear there remains much work to do to save lives. She said, "Scotland suffers a terrible toll from drug deaths, leaving families grieving and in pain, and my heart goes out to all those affected by the death of a loved one through drugs. These latest statistics provide yet more heartbreaking reading, and the situation remains unacceptable. While there is so much more work to do, every life saved means one less family grieving, and I am determined we can use this halt in the upward trend of recent years as a platform for real change." She continued, "My focus now is on taking action and delivering new investment to improve services and to get more people into the treatment that works for them. Residential rehabilitation is one of a range of treatment options available." So, Richard, firstly, have you, and I appreciate that drugs policy and health policy is a Holyrood matter. However, have you seen indications of the national mission being implemented in your constituency or more widely in the North East?
Well, I think there's a range of, I think it's very, very misleading to talk about the drugs problem in Scotland, because I think there are many drugs problems, and the drugs problems in one part of the country may not necessarily be those that are experienced in other parts of the country. I mean, I represent what is on paper a fairly affluent part of Scotland. But nevertheless, I think that there's probably a lot of hidden drugs activity going on up here, simply because those who are involved are many of those involved in what I would term a white-collar drugs culture are high functioning. They can hold down jobs, and they're not coming to the attention of the authorities necessarily through either through medical emergencies or through the criminal justice system, because they're not engaged in acquisitive crime to fund that habit. So I think there are many different drugs problems. I think there's also a range of drugs problems across age groups. We've got ageing cohorts of drug users. Sometimes in tabloids that's referred to as the train spotting generation, and as people get older they develop comorbidities that certainly a persistent drugs habit of whatever substance will not be helping. But I think that this report is, or ought to be, a watershed. It makes it clear that there's a number of, or there are some key interventions that could be made in terms of reform of the drugs law, which is a Westminster matter that could enable us to have a real impact on the drugs problems in Scotland, particularly when it comes to things like safe consumption rooms, which presently would be illegal, and there's always a risk of those public servants who would be involved in working in any such facilities where they set up at the present time to find themselves potentially being prosecuted or breaking the law. So I think that's something that would be an easy thing to reform, and sadly I think in getting caught up in the inevitable politics round about that, we're seeing politicians at Westminster, or with strong Westminster affiliations, saying that that's not something that they should do, and that Scotland has the same powers as any other part of the UK effectively to deal with this in a criminal justice sense and a health sense, and that's true as far as it goes. I think that the reform to the Misuse of Drugs Act, I think, is long overdue to try and tackle that. But the report was called Changing Lives, and I think that gets right to the nub of it. It speaks about ending the stigma that there is around drugs use, ending the discrimination, ending the punishment aspect, and replacing those aspects with approaches with greater care, compassion, and a respect for human rights. And I think that some of the key things that it identifies there, like having a naloxone network, a treatment at the point of need, overdose pathways, emergency and crisis care. That's all important in terms of drawing people back from a crisis point. But what has arguably been neglected, I would say, is those treatment pathways for those who are ready to embark on that kind of pathway. So, however, there are debates about how drug death figures are calculated in Scotland. I have to say I'm persuaded by, there's a good piece of research done by the Ferret Facts Service, which says that whatever slight differences there might be in statistical methodology, none of them individually or collectively are enough to disguise the fact that our drugs death tally is one of the highest in Europe. I reckon there's a whole range of different problems within that. One of the things is that where drugs use crosses across other social problems, like with homelessness or with encounters with the criminal justice system, or where there's a history of psychosis as well, the likelihood of an early death or a premature death involving drugs multiplies several-fold. So there's a whole range of intercepting factors coming down through poverty, through deprivation, and through the interactions that those who are involved in drug use have with wider society. And we can do better, and I think this report is a very timely one, and it points the way to how we can deal with it. And just one last thing, I was at school in the 1980s. I was fully subjected to the just say no message. It didn't work then, it's not going to work now. And the one thing I would like everyone to see, if we all agree, whatever point in the political spectrum we're on, whatever our constitutional preference is, if we can all agree that this is a problem that needs a national endeavour to tackle, and an endeavour across where the political demarcations are, let's recognise that getting tough on this problem isn't just about coming away with the simplistic certitudes that might get a leader writer at the Daily Mail or the Daily Express really excited. It's much more complicated than that, and it's going to require a very, very searching examination of government policy across a range of issues to tackle the problem that's sadly become all too entrenched in parts of Scotland.
Thank you, Richard. Some very good points you're making there, and certainly the need to have a very wide approach involving all parts of our society and government in order to address, as you say, the very high rates of drug deaths that we see in Scotland is necessary. A coordinated and calculated approach, in the same way as we saw with perhaps the Violence Reduction Unit in Glasgow, is undoubtedly what we need to see, and I'm sure we'll be reporting on the progress of the national mission over the weeks and months to come. But let's move on to our next story now, because the UK government has been accused of allowing the cost of living crisis to spiral out of control, as new forecasts show energy bills are set to triple, with the average energy bill likely to rise to £500 for January 2023 alone. The forecast by utility consultants BFY also predicts that the price cap could rise to £3,850 by the end of the year, far exceeding what has previously been predicted, and that's 4 times the cost compared to July 2021. The SNP Shadow Energy Minister, Alan Brown MP, has criticised the Tory government for prioritising pathetic internal squabbles over the real issues of the day, and has called for real action and a swift package of support to help households cope with rising bills and inflation. The predictions come after the leading anti-poverty organisation, the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, said in a recent report that the cost of living support package announced in May 2022 might provide some temporary relief, but for many, the one-off payments will barely touch the sides. So, Richard, what's your mailbag and your email inbox? What are you hearing from your constituents about the impact of the Tory cost of living crisis?
Well, again, like I said at the top of the programme, Andrew, I represent a fairly prosperous, on paper, part of the country, but that hides a lot of significant urban and also rural, particularly rural poverty, and individual cases of poverty. One of the things, one of the ways it is hidden is through the Scottish Index on Multiple Deprivation. Now, that's a fantastic piece of work that provides robust evidence of where poverty exists, but often the geographical spread of poverty, and it picks up concentrations very well. It doesn't pick up the individual cases, and there are an awful lot of people who are who have we live in a part of Scotland that is colder on average than it is further south. But also, particularly once you get out into the rural bits of my constituency, there are issues about transport and getting to work, which means that people are forced to run cars that because of public transport quite clearly cannot serve everybody as they might wish every hour across the day. So there's an awful lot of in-work poverty that just doesn't really get picked up. So when fuel prices rise, folk like my constituents are hit like that with a significant increase in their costs, because car ownership has to be higher here simply because of the way people live their lives. There's also an awful lot of energy customers are off grid, and this forms quite a part of my postbag in this issue, that they rely on heating oil, and the price of heating oil has spiked dramatically over the last few weeks and months, and that's a part of the energy market that is completely unregulated. Also, because of the nature of the housing stock, it can be very, very difficult to retrofit or take advantage of some of the insulation schemes that are there. So some of the obvious things that could be done, where there is grant support available to change people's boilers or to improve the energy, the thermal efficiency of their homes, simply doesn't work here. And when you add that to the additional pressures on people's budgets, as I say, through commuting, and the fact that a sizable number of people are on that unregulated part of the energy market, it becomes very, very difficult. So I've been trying my best to articulate that through Westminster and through other forums. But fundamentally, the way that we get through this, there's a short-term solution and there's a long-term solution. Now, the short-term solution is to put money into people's pockets to help meet those bills. Now, there is the SNP has backed a windfall tax. Now, we don't think it's fair that should fall solely on energy companies, albeit they are taking in profits that are significantly beyond their expectations at present. So while we think it's right to recycle some of that profit to take down bills and to remove the unexpected windfalls from those companies, and prevent those windfalls from being passed on to shareholders, albeit you would catch some of that windfall through the income tax system. We think it's important that windfall tax should be spread across other companies that have done very well, because there are a number of companies that in the current crisis or throughout the pandemic have recorded profits that are well beyond their expectations and have only come about because of that windfall situation that they found themselves in commercially. So we're talking companies like Apple or Amazon or other ones that would, other companies like that. But fundamentally put money into people's pockets through things like restoring the £20 universal credit uplift, make that permanent, bring it back, matching, getting the Westminster government to match the commitment that the Scottish government has made through the Scottish Child Payment. And again, tackling in-work poverty, scrap the national insurance rise. We're long since past the point, I would hope, where anyone is under any illusions whatsoever that is money that's earmarked for the National Health Service. There's £30 billion of financial headroom. There's an argument that I've been making for a while in terms of in tax revenues being higher at Westminster than were expected, and UK borrowing being lower. I was hooted at by Conservatives whenever I pointed that out, that it was fantasy economics, and lo and behold, the lead candidate in the Conservative Party leadership election is now saying, hey, boys and girls, we've got a £30 billion piece of financial headroom that we could actually use here. So it's nice to see that becoming a mainstream thing. So that's an awful lot of money that could be put back into people's pockets to help get over that. But longer term, we need to be investing heavily in renewables. So let's get the Scotland 25 gigawatts of power that's been potential, that's been licensed off the coast of Scotland. Let's look at what we can do to try and get that going again, how we can incentivise companies to invest those aspects of their super profits that wouldn't be touched by any kind of, that haven't been touched by a windfall tax. How can we incentivise that kind of investment in that in our long-term energy security? Because fundamentally, the only way we get our bills under control, the only way we guarantee our energy security in the face of Vladimir Putin threatening to cut off the gas pipes from Siberia, and the only way we tackle the environmental crisis is by effecting that just transition from fossil fuels and using the skills and the personnel in those industries and helping them transition to careers in renewables, which will help us to meet our energy needs now and in the future. And that will help us tackle, as I say, our energy security. It will help us tackle the climate crisis, but it's the only thing that is going to help us lock in the possibility of cheaper, more reliable sources of energy into the future. And so, yeah, there's a short-term solution that involves putting money into people's pockets and making sure there's some fairness restored to the system. But longer term, we need to be positioning ourselves to take full advantage of that. And Scotland is in a unique position. An independent Scotland would be in a unique position there, that we can use the energy resources we have in order to be a reliable, not just to meet our own needs, but also to be a reliable energy partner to help the rest of Europe make that necessary transition as well.
Thanks, Richard. A wide-ranging answer there, and one that reflects, and you make an absolutely rock-solid point that the current crisis requires both short-term and long-term solutions. And one wonders whether the way in which the Times seems to be operate differently in Westminster some ways about what is, and the absence of planning for long-term is going to be a real challenge. But you mentioned there the two candidates standing for leadership of the Tory party. And so I think it's now about time that we talk about the car crash of the Titans now, the Tory leadership cluster Burach. Well, I'll talk to you about both candidates one at a time, and then we'll roll it up if we can. So firstly, the Foreign Secretary has said that Indy Ref 2 will not happen on her watch if she beats Rishi Sunak to Tory leadership. Her position is a little tougher than Boris Johnson, who has only said now is not the time for Scots to begin given another vote on whether to leave the United Kingdom, although, of course, Johnson did turn down the First Minister's request earlier last month. Liz Truss said, "If I become Prime Minister, I would not grant the authority for Indy Ref 2. We are in the midst of a cost of living crisis, and it is an increasingly uncertain time for the world. So the SNP should be focusing on delivering for the Scottish people, and fixing the mistakes they have made in policing, education, and beyond." Now, Richard, there's quite a lot to unpack in just a few sentences there. Firstly, Liz Truss taking a slightly harder line than Johnson. Does that tell us something about her or about those who are backing her?
I'm not sure, to be honest, Andrew. I mean, neither of them are particularly impressive figures. Both of them are absolutely bang average in Tory terms. And but I think that the difficulty here is that in order to win the leadership of their party, they started out talking about having to tell some unpleasant and difficult truths, and then they've spent the rest of the campaign avoiding them and playing to the gallery of one of the most, I'll be as polite as I can, an electorate that is utterly estranged from reality, that believes it can have its cake and eat it, that all problems can be, laid at the doors of whether it's refugees arriving in small boats or whether it's those nasty, horrible Europeans over in Brussels. There's always somebody that is preventing them from achieving their full potential, or high taxes, or regular, whatever. All the rubbish that's designed to, get an approving editorial from the Daily Mail. I mean, I saw an interesting article in the Financial Times, which they thankfully hadn't put behind their paywall, saying that Liz Truss was the best leader for this Conservative Party. And I was immediately drawn to the word "this," because I was very surprised that anyone associated with the FT would have would have endorsed her in that way. And yeah, sure enough, there was more to the article than met the eye. And it was just simply putting many of the points I've just made about the level of delusion that there is amongst the membership about what they can actually have, and the individual groupings, or the ideologically disparate groupings that she's trying to mop up the support of. They've all bought into this idea that they can have their cake and eat it, and that there are no difficult choices to make, and that she'll be the one that goes to Brussels and sticks it to those bloody Europeans, and she'll stick it to that upstart Nicola Sturgeon and all the Scott Nats and all the rest of it. And she's basically just telling people a comforting fairy tale, whereas none of the underlying problems that need to be addressed in terms of the essential weaknesses of the British state and the position it's blundered into over the last 6 years after Brexit will be addressed by that. So, you can either be the candidate who stands up and tells the truth and gets roundly booed for your troubles in all likelihood, or you can be the person who tells comforting lies and fairy stories and then gets in. And but that's the problem. She's going to get caught up in exactly the same hooks as Boris Johnson, because she introduced the Northern Ireland Protocol Bill. She's being lauded for that. She buzzed off after she'd listened to 2 speeches on it. So I don't think there's any huge intellectual engagement with the process. I was sitting there. She listened to David Lammy. She listened to whoever it was that spoke after him, and then disappeared off to whatever her next photo shoot was, and then didn't listen to the arguments that I and others were putting about how this was an act preparatory to breaking international law. So she'll tell people she's got the Northern Ireland Protocol done. We're getting Brexit done again after we've already apparently got it done. But then, of course, tearing up a treaty unilaterally will mean that we end up in that we could potentially end up in, if not quite a trade war, then certainly with a set of trading conditions that are even less optimal than the ones that we're in currently. So I think there's a pathway that she can take to winning the leadership of the Conservative Party. It's hard to see how Rishi Sunak gets there now. I think you can see that his race is almost run here. But she's going to have a hell of a job matching up the promises made in campaigning with what those who are going to put her there are expecting. And, and some of those expectations simply cannot be fulfilled because they're nonsensical, and they always were, because basically they failed to, the Tory party in Parliament and out of Parliament has failed to realise that, yes, the UK might have sovereignty and it might have all these red lines, but other countries also have sovereignty and red lines, and they're just as entitled to defend that as anyone else. And I'll go back to a quote I used in my maiden speech back in early 2020 in Westminster. It was about a quote by the former Danish finance minister, Christian Jensen, who said that there were 2 types of European nations. There are those that are small nations, and there are those that are yet to realise that they are small nations. And the UK is still, at least the Conservative portion of it, still seems to struggle greatly with the idea that they are in fact a small nation and not nearly as big and effective on the international stage as they might wish themselves to be.
Thanks, Richard. Now, as you said, there are, in the interest of balance, there are 2 candidates standing for the leadership of the Tory party. But we're not. What I'll do, I won't look in detail with regard to Rishi Sunak, because there's a wider issue here that I wanted to talk to you about, because the way in which mainstream media across the UK is reporting on the Tory leadership election means that, or it certainly seems to me, that we've got Tory propaganda on our screens and on our radios and in our press pretty much 24/7 at the moment, with apparently no right of reply, let alone any semblance of balance in the reporting, in the breathless reporting of whatever it is that Truss or Sunak have or have not most recently said. How can we begin to address this issue when, especially from a Scottish perspective, Conservative Party leadership election is the interest and is voted on by a tiny number of the electorate?
I'm not sure, to be honest, because it is a legitimate matter of interest who gets to be the next Prime Minister of the UK. And much as I wish Scotland wasn't part of the UK, for the moment at least, we are. and so this outcome affects us. But actually, I think this is maybe a political race whereby the more scrutiny is, the more light of scrutiny is shone, the more helpful it can be to us. Because I can't believe that it's just my inherent anti-Conservative Party biases that are that are being tickled here by seeing two, as I said, absolutely bang average candidates slugging it out against each other, to try and put forward the version of an alternative reality that will most appeal to the limited Tory selectorate that's now out there. So, actually, I think the more that people get a view of this, the more they will. Hopefully, they will not turn off and turn away from politics, but will turn off and turn away not just from the Conservative Party, but also from the idea that Britain any longer has a functioning working politics at Westminster, because in any functioning working politics, the main opposition party would already be streets ahead. And yet we seem to have a Labour Party that's absolutely terrified of its own shadow and unable to capitalise as you might expect that it would in any functioning system. So I think it's good that people get a chance to see both Conservative Party candidates playing to their internal gallery. They'll have a chance to compare that with how they then try and appeal to the UK polity at large. But, I think they're leaving Scotland distinctly unmoved. And I think that Liz Truss, as you said at the top of this item, going further than now is not the time, and saying that there will never be an independence referendum on her watch. Where was that? Where's that voluntary union gone? How are we supposed, where we were being encouraged to lead, not leave? We're seeing, not just through this leadership contest, but also through the Northern Ireland Protocol Bill and the damage that will do to Scotland, exactly where we're left with that. So I actually think it's a good thing that people are getting to see this in all its gory detail, and hopefully people can be led to the conclusions that if you don't want more of this, if you want Scotland to play a full role in the world and for your voices to be heard and your views to be respected, then independence is the only way forward. Because, quite frankly, I think a slightly more insipid version of Toryism and making Brexit work that's on offer from Keir Starmer, it certainly doesn't float my boat, and I can't imagine it floats many other people's boat in Scotland either.
That's a very good point, Richard. Certainly, in terms of both candidates at the moment, I do struggle to work out how it is that they're both making promises that they will do things differently, but I struggle to see how that after more than a decade of Tory rule, everything, and I mean everything, that the Westminster government touches is now in crisis. But you mentioned there the Labour Party, so let's move on and let's look at the Labour Party a little bit more, because Sir Keir Starmer on Thursday rebuffed union leaders who criticised his decision to sack a transport spokesman who joined striking rail workers on the picket line. Starmer, who said the junior shadow minister had been making up policy on the hoof, has had an uneasy relationship with the unions since he became leader 2 years ago, seeking perhaps to move the party towards the centre ground after his predecessor Jeremy Corbyn stepped down. On Wednesday, Starmer sacked Sam Tarry, who had posed with protesting rail workers at Euston Station, defying an order that all shadow ministers should stay away from picket lines. The dismissal perhaps highlights the balancing act that Starmer is pursuing by neither endorsing nor criticising the strikes for fear of antagonising either the unions or the travelling public. Union leaders have applauded Starmer for his support of workplace measures such as his pledge to crack down on zero-hours contracts and backing a higher living wage. However, they have been riled by his refusal to back various industrial actions and by his open support for big business. So, Richard, firstly, a broad point. In the course of the last couple of weeks, Labour has ditched nationalisation, committed to a hard Brexit, says it will ignore Scottish elections, and some would say has waged war on pretty much any signs of socialism. How can anyone honestly belong to the Labour Party in Scotland anymore? Does anyone know what the Labour Party in Scotland is for nowadays?
Well, I certainly don't, and I can't imagine that many other people do either. I mean, it's quite obvious to see the amount of hot air that's being blown into Anna Sarwar's balloon at the moment. The Scottish press have a tendency, it's almost a sacred mission in some respects, or some quarters anyway, to try and blow as much air as they can into the balloon of whoever's most likely to knock the SNP off its perch. So we saw Wendy Alexander get that for a time until that was obviously a lost cause, and they tried it, but it was a bit half-hearted with Richard Leonard. Ruth Davidson certainly got the full benefit of that boosterism, and now that she's fallen by the wayside as well politically, it's Anna Sarwar that's getting the benefit of that. But beyond media creations and sound bites about how the SNP government is supposedly failing on various things, you'll notice that whatever it's accused of failing on, any concrete evidence presented in order to back that up, we're just trying to get in the idea that this is something that's not working, in the hope that if people hear it often enough, it will stick and might influence their voting. And I think the trouble is that Labour, particularly, and you see the Conservatives have done this over a much shorter timescale in Scotland as they're struggling to hold on to their position as the official opposition in Holyrood. But Labour has never taken the trouble to put together, just like the Tories, a compelling set of personalities, people who would be credible as ministers, people who could advance a credible slate of policies for them. And every step that they've taken in order to try and get back to government has effectively been an attempt at a shortcut not to boost their own popularity, but to have a swipe at the SNP in government. And I don't think that that's a route to success. It certainly was never a success when the SNP tried that with previous Labour administrations, and I think they still think that deep down that the SNP has somehow stolen their sweetie, their sacred right to govern Scotland in perpetuity, that we're a bunch of interlopers still, that we've no right to be there, and that they think that there's a shortcut that they can take that doesn't involve the hard graft of, as I say, getting those compelling personalities and getting the compelling policies and a programme for government that might actually persuade people that they're worth voting for, rather than that there's something not worth voting for about the SNP. But I think that anyone with any inclination to do that in the Labour Party in Scotland must be holding their head in their hands at the way that their comrades south of the border are operating. I mean, Keir Starmer, on paper, ought to have been like kryptonite to somebody like Boris Johnson, and yet it took some of Boris Johnson's very, very obvious personal failings to come to the fore before he was eased onto a pathway out of office. It wasn't necessarily anything that the Labour Party had done in terms of setting out a compelling alternative vision or holding ministers to account that did that. It was Boris Johnson's undoing in the end was Boris Johnson himself. But you have to also wonder about a Labour Party, as I said a few moments ago, that seems to be frightened of its own shadow. They seem to be so spooked by the way that they lost seats in the red wall that they, again, a bit like Scotland, thought were their seats by right, that they're not prepared to have respectful but challenging conversations with people about what Brexit actually means and how the UK government won't actually level up. They seem to be trying to fight this on, rather than by changing people's minds and inspiring them and changing the political weather and actually leading opinion, they seem to have just accepted the lie of the land, as the Tories have gone on to partially redefine it with their election win in 2019. So I think that the Labour Party, it should be absolutely confident about it should be able to have an absolutely confident message about the cost of living crisis, about workers' rights. It should have an absolutely confident message about the willingness to stand up for the rights of people in the workplace. It should have a confident message about how we can't have people suffering from a cost of living crisis at a time when there are significant surpluses being generated in other parts of the economy. And yeah, I just don't see why you would think that there was a clear pathway and an open door there for Keir Starmer to push at, but he just doesn't seem to have the character or the chops for it, and the Labour Party seems, as I say, too frightened of its own shadow to put forward any kind of compelling alternative vision other than we'll not be as bad as that lot, and waiting for it to fall into their laps. Now, that might well, of course, happen, but at the same time, you would expect them to be making real hay at the moment and really stretching out a lead in the polls and it's just not happening. And I think if it leaves me, I've never been a Labour Party supporter, but I've always been centre left social democrat in my outlook. And if they can't inspire somebody of that kind of background, I don't see how they're going to be doing that anywhere in the UK. And of course, when they've got such a wishy-washy message on Scotland and how they would like to see governance in Scotland evolve, and how they're setting themselves four square at the moment against giving the Scottish people a right to determine their own future, it's just a double negative in Scotland.
Well, that's a very good point, and I was going to ask you about that, Richard, because last week Keir Starmer said he would not be ideological about nationalising public utilities. That was after the Shadow Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, sparked a backlash by suggesting that Labour had now ditched plans to take rail, water and energy back into public ownership. Now, thinking about that message from a Scottish perspective, does that now imply that in the event of a Labour government in Westminster, that they would pursue privatising Scottish Water and ScotRail once they'd taken power?
Well, I think they'd be taking their political life into their hands if they were to do that, because if there is a model which shows that public ownership has worked, it is Scottish Water. The quality of our water is better over the piece, and our bills are now lower. Now, that wasn't always the case in terms of our bills being lower, but just like in the energy sector, the private sector running water utilities south of the border have done what the private sector will always do. They will strip out what they think is inefficiency and excess capacity, and take maintenance down to the lowest level that from a regulatory point of view and a public relations point of view they think they can balance, and the shareholders are the ones who benefit rather than the consumers. And I think you can see now that ScotRail has been taken back into public ownership in Scotland. You can see the febrile desperation of people calling it, saying how a matter of 2 or 3 months of public ownership have somehow been a failure. Yet it's not. But yet we've dealt with the Scottish Government and Transport Scotland have dealt with the pay claims in ScotRail, when there is now disruption on the railway through industrial action. It's as a result of a UK-wide industrial dispute rather than something that's specific to Scotland. And I just think that it's past time that we got over the idea that private ownership or the private sector always has the answers. I've been privileged in a varied working life to work in the private sector and the public sector, both. And anyone that thinks that inefficiency isn't something that is also tolerated in the private sector is living in cloud cuckoo land. It is there. And there is also the added cost to the consumer that somebody is looking to take a profit. Now, I think it's perfectly reasonable that private companies should make profits. Of course they should. That's the reason they're in existence. But when you're providing a public service, that becomes problematic, especially if, like on the railways, there is an element of public subsidy going in, which is effectively underwriting the private profit in inverted commas at the end of the day. So I think there are very, very strong arguments for public ownership of some things like Scottish Water proves it. I think it will be proven that taking ScotRail into public ownership was the right thing to do. I can understand why any incoming Labour government wouldn't want to, bite off more than it can chew, and that. But certainly there are models where public ownership is not only in the best interests of the consumer, it's also just fundamentally the right thing to do. And again, I think if that should be meat and drink for any incoming Labour government in certain respects, and the fact that they're running away from it again just shows that they're just like Blair's government, and they seem to be absolutely determined to get in there on the basis of not frightening the horses, on the basis that what's in the past is in the past, and what matters is what works, and it's about what you do going forward that counts. And yep, I get that argument, but nevertheless, there are some things that they could be doing to restore some equity in the overall economic settlement that we live in. And again, it's disappointing that they don't seem to be willing to engage with that argument.
Thanks, Richard. That's completely the failure to engage is continues to be astonishing. But what we'll do now, let's now roll up the three politicians who we've been discussing mainly this afternoon. With regard to an independence referendum for Scotland, Truss says not on her watch. Sunak wants to intervene in devolved matters more, and Starmer has just said no to an independence referendum. So, Richard, arguably the biggest contract that unionists play in their discourse about an independence referendum, apart from dismissing and ignoring the mandate out of hand, is that they make out that they are denying one politician or party rather than the democratic will of the people of Scotland. Do these Westminster politicians not realise how terrible their deeply undemocratic rhetoric looks to anyone else living in any other democratic society?
I genuinely don't think that they do, and it's something that infects the political culture there. It's routine to be interviewed on radio or television on national, in inverted commas, broadcasters based south of the border, and to be told that as if it's an immutable fact, forever preserved in stone, that the Scottish government, the Scottish Parliament, doesn't have the right to legislate on independence, whereas we know that is something that has never been put to the test. But there is just absolute certainty that the power is at Westminster. That's absolutely right, that's where the power should be, and that somehow the people of Scotland are being hoodwinked, that they don't actually know what it is that they want. They weren't actually voting for the things that they were told, even by the opponents of the SNP, that they were in fact voting for. I mean, I can remember Douglas Ross saying, a vote for the SNP is a vote for a referendum. So, well, if even Douglas Ross says it, that they've been campaigning on that basis and were roundly defeated on that basis in Scotland. So, I think anyone that stands against the right of the Scottish people to choose their own future is heading for the political rocks, and it can take a while, but we have ample evidence of what that looks like when it happens. I think most notably in 1997, where the Conservatives were reduced to no MPs in Scotland at all, and this is not a sustainable position, because you're not talking about a bunch of a very, very noisy but vocal minority in Scotland. Polls are regularly showing that support for independence is running 50-50. This is something that transcends geographical area, it transcends social class, it transcends socio-economic status, it transcends, most, if you look at the demographic breakdown, it seems that most people under the age of 55 now in Scotland are in favour, whether male or female, support independence. So this is not a tide that can be stood against forever. But it's not just the media class, it's not just those who lead political parties or those who would aspire to it. You often find this attitude even in the lower ranks of political parties. We've heard Lisa Nandy, the Labour MP for one of the Wigan seats, saying that the UK government should treat those campaigning for Scottish independence in the way that the Spanish government has treated those seeking the same outcome in Catalonia. If that's the level of analysis going on, then God help us. But if they want to create the impression, if they want to have, perpetuate the idea that Scotland is a union through choice, you cannot do that and simultaneously deny Scottish people a choice that they have consistently voted for and that polls show Scots consistently want, irrespective of how they would go on to exercise that choice by voting in any referendum. So I think they're about to find out that people in Scotland don't take kindly to being told what they can and can't do. And we're obviously going through a process right now in the Supreme Court that might well take it out of the hands of politicians. I think it'll be very interesting to see how Liz Truss reacts to that, if she becomes leader of the Conservatives, as looks likely, and if the Supreme Court decides that it is in fact within the powers of the Scottish Parliament to legislate for a referendum. And, if we see the Conservatives then legislating to make it outside the powers of the Scottish Parliament to do that and apply that retrospectively, the jig is effectively up, because they will be seen not just within Scotland but also around the world as being afraid of the voice of the people, and I don't think that's somewhere that any sensible, competent above all, confident government, and a government confident in its arguments would want to be. And to be perfectly honest, I think at that stage you would find that many influential Scots about unionist persuasion would also find that that was something that stuck in their craw, and that they wouldn't be putting up with that either.
That's a very good point, Richard. I was going to ask you, in the event that and this is hypothetical, of course, but in the event that the Supreme Court says, yes, of course, this is a democracy, please have your second independence referendum, what are unionists going to do? Do you think primary legislation from Westminster, be it from blue unionists or red unionists, do you think that primary legislation is one of the likely outcomes?
I honestly don't know. I think it would be a very, very ill-advised outcome for them to do. But I think what we now have to do is just wait and see what the Supreme Court decides. Of course, fundamentally, it's been asked to give a legal opinion on what it might judge as essentially a problem that can only be resolved by politics. And they're correct. If that were the outcome, I think that would be one that's hard to quibble with, because it is something that ultimately can only be resolved by politics and respect, and in the final analysis, by Westminster respecting the right of the people of Scotland to exercise whether or not they wish to remain in what always has been, at least up until now, a voluntary union. And it would be a bizarre situation indeed, would it not, if we were to have a situation where the UK government has said that when it comes to Northern Ireland, it has no, through the Good Friday Agreement, it has no selfish or strategic interest there, and expressly respects the views of the majority, whatever the views of that majority may turn out to be, but says, but not you, Scotland. That would be an utterly unsustainable position to be in, and the idea that we would be in a union of equals would be shown up forevermore as utter nonsense. So unions like the one that we're supposed to be in can only ever be held together by consent. So far, Scots, with the one vote they've ever had on it in 2014, chose, much to my chagrin, but I respect the result, to stay in the UK. But that did not end democracy, and I think we're about to enter into some interesting times. But fundamentally, if this union is based on consent, then the Scots have to be able to leave. Scots have to be able to leave it voluntarily and through democratic means, and the challenge will go back to Westminster ultimately. So, well, if now is not the time, when is the time? And if that's not the way you go about that, what is?
Absolutely, Richard. Thank you. The message that at least from the unionist perspective, that this is not a union that's held together by consent, and this is not a union of equals, seems to be being broadcast more and more loudly by Westminster politicians. And as you say, it maybe reflects the pretty poor quality of the politicians who are being elected to Westminster in England in particular at the moment. But Richard, thank you for that analysis. I'm very grateful to you, but that is all that we have time for this afternoon. In making these programmes, Broadcasting Scotland relies on the support of viewers and others who value our distinctive approach to news, current affairs and culture. Please help us to continue to make these programmes, to continue to develop the station, and to make new programmes for you. If you would like to support us, then please subscribe or donate to Broadcasting Scotland. You will find the link to do that on the screen now. We continue to depend upon your financial assistance because the urgent need for financial support has not gone away. There are other ways in which you can contribute to our work. If you would like to volunteer to work with Broadcasting Scotland, either behind the scenes or in front of the cameras or in any other way that promotes the station, then please visit our website at www.broadcastingscotland.scot and send us a message there. You can find us on Twitter at BroadcastScot. Please like and retweet us there. And you can also find us on Facebook by searching for Broadcasting Scotland. When you're watching us on YouTube, it would be great if you would like and subscribe to Broadcasting Scotland on that platform. Meantime, we will be here again tomorrow evening with the next edition of Scotland at 7, so please tune in at 7 o'clock and join us again then. I hope that you enjoyed a tasty full Scottish this afternoon, Thinking for a moment about Scottish culture and national heroes, on this day in 1786, Robert Burns published poems chiefly in the Scottish dialect, which is commonly known as the Kilmarnock edition. It was printed by John Wilson of Kilmarnock. It was the first published edition of Burns's work, and it cost 3 shillings. 612 copies were printed. Of course, it includes Tea Moose, and also the author's earnest cry and prayer to the Right Honourable and Honourable the Scotch representatives in the House of Commons. So I'd like to say thank you to everyone who's been watching this afternoon, and a very special thanks to our very special guest, Richard Thomson MP, who is an Honourable Scotch representative in the House of Commons. Thanks, Richard.
My pleasure.
I hope that everyone has a very peaceful Sunday, and everyone can join us again here on Broadcasting Scotland very soon. Bye-bye.